I think the 1985 children's film Return to Oz is an absolute classic. It's one that I loved back when I saw it at age 9 or 10. And when I rewatched it earlier this year in 2024, I was really struck by how many layers of intriguing, fascinating stuff the film has for me as an adult. In this video here, I want to just say a little bit about the significance of the character of Ozma. First time we see her in this film is in that extended early portion of the film, which a lot of us as kids found to be one of the more disturbing sequences in the film. This is the portion set in the creepy hospital. If you remember, as soon as Aunt Em leaves, everything just starts going south. And the fear just kind of builds and builds, even though Dorothy probably feels like she isn't supposed to be scared because nothing, quote unquote, scary, nothing that seems like it ought to be scary is happening. It's just everything is just kind of not right, like in a bad dream. But within this whole uncomfortable dark sequence that launches the story off, Ozma, even though she's not called Ozma in this portion, and it'd be debatable whether you even ought to call her Ozma or if she's just the mysterious blonde girl. But Ozma is kind of the little beacon of light that just kind of shows through in the dark in these little moments early on. Kind of like a comforting little nightlight. I remember when I was a little kid and I was scared of the dark. For the longest time, I would ask my mom to leave a nightlight on outside my room. Not enough to keep you awake or to let you think it's daytime, but just enough of a little comforting glow to remind you everything's going to be okay. And specifically, that no monsters are going to get you in the middle of the night. That's how I feel about Ozma's appearances in this early portion of the film. Starting with the part where Dorothy sees the image in the reflection when they're talking in the study/foyer. Starting there, and then when it waves at her in the mirror when she turns around, and there's this blonde girl staring out of the mirror, in that study/foyer area, while Dr. Worley is busy telling Dorothy that she's crazy and that she's having these delusional hallucinations. Not only does these appearances, not only does that lead to joy and awe for Dorothy, she's kind of like, her eyes get big and her jaw drops open, but it's also a little reminder to the viewer that things are going to be okay because Dorothy's not alone. But at that point, while she's just getting told by Dr. Worley that she's crazy, things weren't really that bleak at that point, not yet. But then Aunt Em leaves and things gradually get scarier and scarier. And Dorothy feels really, really alone. She's stuck. She ends up being stuck in that little room all by herself, left alone. Remember, she looks out the window and she sees the horse-drawn carriage going away, and she's kind of stuck there by herself. And the only person she can expect to see is the grouchy head nurse who stole her lunch pail a minute ago. And it's raining, and of course she sees the carriage leaving as this is the deeper reminder that Aunt Em is really gone, like really, really gone, and then there's thunder and lightning, which is always kind of scary, and in a context like that could make you feel a little bit even more alone. And she's kind of just alone, awaiting the unknown in fear, trying to tell herself that nothing bad is going on, trying to tell herself she's just imagining things. And then the beacon of light begins to glow, mysteriously, out of nowhere, so to speak. And there's this mysterious girl who had smiled and waved out of the reflections and out of the mirror early on. To me, this moment really feels deeply symbolic, and it feels like it's supposed to be symbolic when she steps into Dorothy's room. The music and the way she's filmed, for example, being the way they center her in the middle of the doorway, it makes her feel mysterious and otherworldly in a kind of wonderful, trust-inspiring kind of way. And then, of course, she calls Dorothy by name, where if she's just another patient, she shouldn't know Dorothy's name, all things being equal, unless she's been doing a lot of listening, which I suppose she could have been doing. While I found the actress's performances near the end of the movie to be less compelling, here in this early part, she seems like really the most perfect, this authentic, trust-invoking, lovable person fitting perfectly into this role she's supposed to play, which is this mysterious girl who Dorothy mysteriously feels this kind of trusting bond with, as though this is someone she's always known and will always trust. In terms of the kind of symbolic flavor, it almost feels like the film's trying to present something like a guardian angel kind of sensibility. like Ozma is the spiritual being, kind of like the way angels are portrayed a lot of the time, or specifically the kind of mythical guardian angel kind of idea. Like she's the spiritual being that's been watching over Dorothy. You don't hear her when she shows up. Same thing when she leaves. And of course, there's thunderstorms. So theoretically, the opening and closing of the door is covered by a thunderclap. You'd still expect to hear the door or footsteps at some point. Once again, it's the kind of thing where you can look at it either way, but the end result is that it feels mysterious, magical, kind of awe-inspiring. She acts like she knows Dorothy, and Dorothy acts like she has this feeling of familiarity, as though they have always been friends, even though clearly they've never met. For the viewer, this scene is the oasis of comfort and calm in the midst of fear. And then later on, toward the end, as the sequence winds down, it ends up being Ozma who ends up rescuing Dorothy so we can move toward the resolution of Dorothy's escape. So Ozma literally brings about the resolution of the nightmare. It's talking about just the first portion of the movie. She does that not without difficulty, but as a very central part of that resolution. And not only does she resolve the source of fear by helping Dorothy escape, but perhaps more importantly, she resolves Dorothy's inner turmoil about whether this is all in her head, whether she is crazy. Because even before she helps Dorothy escape, long before that, Ozma gave Dorothy comfort simply by the fact that she heard the screams too, and that she's assuming the things that Dorothy has been suspecting, namely this idea that things are not right in this creepy place. Okay, so in plot structure, she's the source of hope. In an intriguing symbolic spiritual sense, she seems to be kind of a particular symbolic beacon of hope of some kind. But what about in universe, with the in-universe story? How does she fit in with that? Who or what is she actually in terms of the logic of the story? Well, there's a couple ways you can look at it. If you see it as a dream, which isn't my preferred interpretation, I would argue most ways of looking at it as a dream don't work. The one way I've found that it does work, it does become coherent if, as long as you think of the dream as starting before Dorothy finds the key. Remember, she found the key outdoors in Kansas. If you think of the dream as starting before that point and still being a dream, even at the very end when the credits are rolling, that's the only way to me that it makes sense to see it as being just a dream. Also, I do feel that the hospital portion does feel very much like an ordinary nightmare. But anyway, all that to say, so if you do see it as a dream, then you could suggest that Ozma would represent the idealized form in Dorothy's mind of the category of best friend. Her appearance during this sequence would, in that case, it would be a reflection of Dorothy's inner desire to reach out to someone she trusts when she's afraid. Her desire to connect with somebody who's on her level, in a way, but who's older enough that she can lean on her, but young enough that she still gets her, instead of just being swept along like an older person would be, like someone like Aunt Em, who's just kind of swept along in all the malicious delusions that adults seem to be prone to in all the frightening nightmares. If it's not a dream, on the other hand, then Ozma would be, well, Ozma from Oz, I suppose, trapped by the witch in a magical prison, but still having some magical powers that the witch didn't know about. So in this situation, in this way of looking at it, the reason the key showed up in Kansas that Dorothy found, the reason it showed up would be because when things got desperate in Oz and things were looking really bad, well, the Scarecrow managed to use some magic to send the key on a shooting star to Dorothy, particularly, right before he was taken captive by the Gnome King. It was his last effort, his last-ditch attempt to make things better. And then meanwhile, Ozma, captured by the witch, she meanwhile managed to use her magical princess powers to project herself into our world in order to try to guide Dorothy back to Oz. In favor of this interpretation, notice the line near the end of the movie when Dorothy says to Ozma, "I thought you'd drowned." And Ozma just continues her knowing gaze, implicitly seeming to accept her identity as that same magical, sagely rescuer from earlier in the story, kind of implicitly implying that she remembers the same thing Dorothy remembers about everything that happened back when they first met. When they first met and she rescued Dorothy from captivity instead of Dorothy rescuing her from captivity. near the end. Now, in terms of magically projecting herself into our world, I guess we know that she wasn't a mere projection in terms of like just a visual projection of an image, because remember they held hands as they tried to escape. They held hands, that same hand that Dorothy grabs onto at the end of the film to allow Ozma to escape that mirror-like magical prison and regain her role as the princess over the Emerald City. In that early portion of the film, that nightmare portion, they hold hands like any pair of young girls running from witches and wheel carts, presumably partly from the healthy habit so they don't lose each other, maybe implicitly on a subconscious level. They're holding hands also to provide a much needed internal unconscious reminder that the other girl is actually real in this world where everything is not what it seems. But then in that later portion near the end of the film, Dorothy grabs her hand so that they'll never be separated again, so that they can be friends forever, freed from both the terrors in the one world as well as the terrors in the other world, with only their friendship remaining. Now, I guess this is just the power of nostalgia, probably, but I love the character of Ozma in Return to Oz, and I think there's just something so matchlessly magical about the end of the film when Dorothy finds that the princess and her new best friend is going to be there forever. Ozma goes from being the source of comfort in the midst of a terrifying nightmare to being a familiar lost friend who Dorothy discovers with excitement near the end. She discovers her trapped there, and she's privileged to be able to return the favor by rescuing her. And then once they've rescued each other and returned the favor both ways, Ozma helps Dorothy get back home where she has longed to be for so long. And then suddenly we find out that they'll actually never lose each other. Not only is she the idealized best friend, she's also the magical princess who brings the wonder of Oz into Dorothy's ordinary life, and even represents this permanent bridge between the land of wonder and the land of the ordinary. The land of the ordinary, where Dorothy belongs and where she finds the safety and familiarity of a loving family. I mean, how could you imagine a happier ending? I wonder if maybe more than anything else, Return to Oz is really first and foremost about love through and through. Dorothy's love for her old friends. Remember that whole first portion of the movie was so sad. And that painting in the witch's attic of Dorothy's old friends, the Scarecrow and the Lion and the Woodman, that painting was so special and so important because it was part of why this whole movie feels so sad for that whole first portion. Because in a way, it's kind of about her love for her old friends. And then Dorothy's love for Jack and Jack's love for Dorothy, which is why it's so special when Jack asks her if he can call her mom. And then that one part where he says to her, "Good night, Mom," as they float along the night sky on the Gump sofa. And then Dorothy's love for TikTok and all the feelings of safety and warmth that come over some of us viewers when we even think about TikTok, which happens partly because I noticed his eyes, they did his eyes in a way to make him seem real and human, even though the rest of him is very much like, about as real as, the tea kettle on your stove. But that's partly what makes him seem kind of human. And also partly because the Dorothy actress does such a great job emoting how she feels about him. And also because of how good it felt. If you remember when TikTok fought off the Wheelers for the first time, and then how it felt when he wound down helplessly just a little bit later in the witch's palace. All those feelings that you get from all these things happening. And then that tender moment later on toward the end when TikTok cried as they said goodbye inside the Gnome King's palace. And then Dorothy's love for all her Oz friends. If you remember that really tearful goodbye right before she headed home with the slippers. And then the especially pronounced love that Aunt Em and Uncle Henry have for Dorothy when they find her outside, when they scoop her up. Aunt Em scoops her up, or I forget which one of them scoops her up first, but and they're just beside themselves with relief. And of course, the visible love that Dorothy has for them, which we notice especially when she's finally got home again and she's truly happy. and the love that Dorothy has for Ozma, and the joy of finding out they don't have to lose each other. And if you listen closely enough to the plot, then you realize that Dorothy doesn't have to lose any of her friends for good, because she can go back whenever she wants with Ozma's help. She can go back to see Jack, and for Jack to see her, to see Tick-Tock, and Tick-Tock to see her, to see her old friends that she was ready to die for, the Scarecrow, the Woodman, and the Lion, to see Ozma, even to see Billina the hen, who was always so much fun to have around. Return to Oz really is maybe a story about love and connection and the feeling of being safe and loved. Of course, it's also about other things such as fear and losing your mind and all that crazy good stuff, but definitely love. And I guess that's part of why the movie is priceless. So maybe if we're gonna, take something away from the film in terms of what it reminds us about ourselves, about the real world around us, that kind of thing, psychological realities, which every good film is going to show us things about the real world, or else why would it hold our attention? Why would it make us feel deeply? So maybe if we're going to identify what it is that we take away from a film like this, maybe the biggest takeaway ought to be just how much relationships matter. The fact that you've probably had an Ozma in your life at some point when you were afraid or uncomfortable or anxious, kind of like in that first part of the film, how she had that very important role as a beacon of light and hope, and gave Dorothy the opportunity to feel like someone is there for her when no one else is. And you've certainly had a chance to be an Ozma to somebody. There's no question about that. Either you have or you will. The film reminds us not to take our feelings of love, safety, security, belonging, and hope for granted. And our sanity as well, of course. You remember that beautiful portion near the middle of the movie, maybe a little past the middle. I think it serves in the scope and structure. I think it kind of is the center point, even though it's not technically in the number of minutes. It's not actually on the middle, but you wouldn't expect that. But I think it serves as the middle. It's kind of joining the two halves of the film. The part where they're on the Gump sofa flying along, you hear the voo, 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 as if you didn't feel calm enough. They give you a little bit of a rhythmic pulse. And Dorothy is about to fall asleep against the night sky with all her friends around her. And they all say goodnight one after another. And Dorothy says, "Whatever happens, I'm awfully sleepy right now. And I'm just glad I have my own head to be sleepy with." Because remember, they just escaped the headless witch. And we've got both those themes together there. The precious beauty of a quiet evening surrounded by people who love you, as well as a peaceful, quiet reminder to be grateful that your head is still attached firmly in place, that you still have your own dignity and identity. And I think there's a subtle but powerful double meaning possibly here as well, because even though she just escaped the headless witch, if you remember, last time she fell asleep was when she had just escaped Worley's machine, and they're floating on the water, or she's floating on the water by herself. So I wonder if we're supposed to think of both when she says, "I'm just glad I have my own head to be sleepy with." So on the one hand, it is this beautiful, quiet moment that reminds us, let's be grateful for the people around us who care about us. Let's take the time to notice, to tell these people, to hear from these people, and to tell them. But also, like Dorothy said, let's be grateful for the coherence of the universe. And no matter what people have tried to do to you, once the trauma fades and heals, you still got your own head. You still got your own head to be sleepy with. And not to mention, while you're at it, you're probably not completely alone.